The knavery of slavery. South Asia. Slavery in India was widespread by the 6th century BC and perhaps even as far back as the Vedic period. Slavery intensified during the Muslim domination of northern India after the 11th century. Slavery existed in Portuguese India after the 16th century. The Dutch, too, largely dealt in Abyssinian slaves, known in India as Habshis or Sheets. Arakan/Bengal, Malabar, and Coromandel remained the largest sources of forced labor until the 1660s. Between 1626 and 1662, the Dutch exported on an average 150 to 400 slaves annually from the Arakan-Bengal coast. During the first 30 years of Batavia's existence, Indian and Arakanese slaves provided the main labor force of the Dutch East India Company, Asian headquarters. An increase in Coromandel slaves occurred during a famine following the revolt of the Naika Indian rulers of South India, Tanjavur, Senji, and Madurai, against Bijapur overlordship, 1645, and the subsequent devastation of the Tanjavur countryside by the Bijapur army. Reportedly, more than 150,000 people were taken by the invading Deccani Muslim armies to Bijapur and Golconda. In 1646, 2,118 slaves were exported to Batavia, the overwhelming majority from southern Coromandel. Some slaves were also acquired further south at Tondi, Adirampatnam, and Kyalpatnam. Another increase in slaving took place between 1659 and 1661 from Tanjavur as a result of a series of successive Bijapuri raids. At Nagapatnam, Pulicat, and elsewhere, the company purchased 8,000 to 10,000 slaves, the bulk of whom were sent to Ceylon, while a small portion were exported to Batavia and Malacca. Finally, following a long drought in Madurai and southern Coromandel in 1673, which intensified the prolonged Madurai Maratha struggle over Tanjavur and punitive fiscal practices, thousands of people from Tanjavur, mostly children, were sold into slavery and exported by Asian traders from Nagapattinam to Aceh, Johor, and other slave markets. In September 1687, 665 slaves were exported by the English from Fort St. George, Madras. And in 1694–96, when warfare once more ravaged South India, a total of 3,859 slaves were imported from Coromandel by private individuals into Ceylon. The volume of the total Dutch Indian Ocean slave trade has been estimated to be about 15 to 30% of the Atlantic slave trade, slightly smaller than the trans-Saharan slave trade, and 1.5 to 3 times the size of the Swahili and Red Sea coast and the Dutch West India Company slave trades. According to Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the Indian governor there were an estimated 8 or 9 million slaves in India in 1841. About 15% of the population of Malabar were slaves. Slavery was legally abolished in the possessions of the East India Company by the Indian Slavery Act, 1843. In Southeast Asia, the Hill tribe people in Indochina were hunted incessantly and carried off as slaves by the Siamese or Thai, the Annamites or Vietnamese, and the Cambodians. A Siamese military campaign in Laos in 1876 was described by a British observer as having been transformed into slave-hunting raids on a large scale. The census, taken in 1879, showed that 6% of the population in the Malay Sultanate of Perak were slaves. Enslaved people made up about 2/3 of the population in part of North Borneo in the 1880s,